can kill yourself. You can drink your own, but I'll never kill myself. Just a chance that I always saw you turn around. But I know it's something different cause it's something else. I am underwater, floating over what I I'm laughing because it feels like I am finally somewhere that makes sense. I feel so fucked up, but I just wanna be fucked up with you. You just get it. I'm just so glad we're friends. Sometimes I just wonder who I am. Sometimes I want to kill who I am. Sometimes I don't want to feel anything at all. I know you're right there, hello, hello. I'm sorry I sing my prayer out of tune. I never thought I could go to heaven until I died and I met you. Is the truth just too depressing? My body hardly knows how to move. I'm crawling through the dying soul. I think I see one flower bloom. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Dead girls try each other's eyes and pretend for a while that we're still alive. Suffering, mind crushed, no release. Blah blah blah, it goes on. It goes on, it goes on. Suffering, mind crushed, no release. Blah blah blah, it goes on. It goes on, it goes on. I'll be trapped here forever. I'll be trapped here forever and ever. Throw away is sad. My soul is hiding on the floor. I know the patterns of these pores right on the backs of my hands. My blood is sad. My bones are ash. My stomach's full of clay. This happens every day. This town is destined to decay. This body feels like a grave.
Programming like this is made possible by viewers like you.
Every day, I'm so fucking freaked out. Every day, I can get the evil out. Every night, I feel so far away. Someday, will it ever be okay?
Every day it's a brand new episode. Every day I guess we'll see just how far it goes. Every day it seems like no one sees and no one knows. Every day I kinda wanna cancel the show.
Most days, I just feel like I'm taking a shot. I pray to God that I'm just taking a shot. I wish this was just a cartoon so I could be like, this is real as fuck. I love the way they don't give up. Tweet about it more. Stories like this so important, but it really happened. Oh God, it really happened.
So I have this idea for like a cartoon or something, and it's like there's these fucked up kids, and like through the power of
Understanding.
yeah, it can totally be understanding or like forgiveness or something. They like overcome all their fears, and in the end, they turn out totally Every day it's another new episode. Every day slice a bit more meat off the bone.
I'm such a
Me
faker
off the
in the
bone.
crisis line, only just busy. I feel so guilty. What the fuck? 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 I'm a mess, beautiful monster, psycho dreaming, I'm something different. Be yourself, earth is so poisoned, life is so boring, there's not much left to do. Get caught apart and consumed. You can be me too if you really want to know what it's like when the sky is love and the air is honey. When the people shout and stop and stare 'cause you don't look like the people on TV. That's okay, 'cause the world is meant to change and it should change. I'd love to see the world in a beautiful new shape. Broken parts, garbage mind, fall apart, misaligned, start again, push yourself back up and then pretend. I've tried so hard to be good.
Mount Celeste is the unofficial name for a mountain located on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. It shares the name Celeste with two peaks in the Cariboo region of the BC interior, within the boundaries of Strathcona Provincial Park. This peak lies at the north end of Reese Ridge. Iceberg Peak lies at the south end of this ridge. Hello. Hello, everyone. Bye. Oh, I turned off chat on the screen for some reason. Whoops. There are some musicians that you listen to when mentally ill, and Black Dress is definitely one of them. Oh, absolutely. I think they're really good for the record. They're really good, and I related to some of their songs way too much. Imagines you in a tight black dress. I think I've drawn that. Multiple times, probably. Let me see if I can find the picture real quick. Whenever Tumblr decides it wants to load. There we go. Yeah, it's more of a blue dress than a black dress, but similar image. There it is.
Music isn't magic. I'm not sure that music is anything at all. If it was the answer, don't you think that all our problems would be solved?
I'm trying to read some noise gate a little bit.
The same as it always was. The pain still lives in my head,
There we go.
but that's okay.
Now it picks up me taking a sip. Very important, obviously.
I'm sure I'll be dead if all we need is love. Could there be enough to undo what we
If I remember correctly, the previous stream was a fucking disaster in terms of internet issues.
need is love?
I think it turned out that for most of the stream, one of the cables on my router was a little bit loose. So hopefully that shouldn't be an issue. It hasn't been an issue for me in a bit.
There be enough to undo what we've done. If all we need is love, could there be enough? Could there be enough?
Looking at you.
From the outside, it's simple. There's a wound and it is bleeding. It is obvious and visible. Healing isn't ideal, that's supposed to be real. That's supposed to be real. Is it real? Is it real? That's what the inside would do for you. There's only so much that a song can
Right, I always forget to set this up. We are going to be reading Julia Serano's Whipping Girl from 2007.
makes it easy to pretend.
Let's see. I'm gonna pin the book itself in chat. If you are watching the VOD, it's going to be in the description. And then you can read along. Let me find what page I left off at. We left off at page 109, if you want to read along. Usually at the start of the stream, I like to read a little bit further back just to get back into it. Let's see here. Last time we read a lot about effemimania and traditional sexism, I think. Which mostly boils down to the idea, okay, very important terms were oppositional sexism and traditional sexism. Where traditional sexism is the idea that femininity and femaleness are worse inherently than masculinity and maleness. Oppositional sexism is the idea that the two genders are two mutually exclusive and opposite things that have no overlap or should not have overlap, right? And then Julia Serano describes effemimania that stems from that kind of interaction, where femininity and moving towards femininity is seen as worse, right? And especially when it shows up in men, people tend to view femininity as worse, right? When society says you should be a man, it views femininity in masculinity as uniquely threatening in some way. And it medicalizes it, and it makes it all a big deal and whatever. I think that's roughly what we were reading last time.
Just normal girls.
There we go.
Understand, would we still connect? Would we recognize? Would we still
Concept is the same as every other Celeste stream I've done so far. If I'm understanding correctly, effemimania is an intersection of oppositional sexism and traditional sexism. Yes. And I think you can make the argument that transmisogyny is also an intersection of oppositional sexism and traditional sexism, right? A lot of these ideas stem from that interaction, right? I think Julia Serano basically makes the case that while sometimes describing things as, transphobia or misogyny or homophobia is helpful, usually the root of those things, of those bigotries, stem from oppositional sexism or traditional sexism or both, right? I think that's at least my understanding from what I read from the book. Anyways, the concept of the stream is the same as the last times. We're going to be playing Celeste, and every time I die, I have to read one page of Julia Serano's Whipping Girl from 2007. This is the 4th stream I've done so far. We are about to head into, like, the end of the game. Of, like, the main storyline, at least. I am not actually sure if I'm going to die enough to finish the whole book. Because there's only 2 stages left. And to its credit, like, chapter 7 in Celeste is very long and difficult. And that might be a nightmare stream for me, but I want to commit to the bit. But also, importantly, I'm only on page 109 of 315. I think like the last 40 pages or so are all kind of like stuff I don't really need to read. It's notes and stuff that I don't really care about. So it's like, what, another 100 and something? 100 and... Oh my god, I'm bad at math. 170 pages. I need to die another 170 times. The most I've died so far is, I think, about almost 40 times in one stream. So we have a long way to go. I need to update some mod loader stuff real quick. Why is my, like, Ko-fi donations thing not showing up anywhere? That's odd. Let me check something real quick. Okay, whatever. Can I send, like, a test? Okay, yeah, no, that's not working on the stream visual itself. Whatever, not important. Make sure this shit is set up correctly. Oh yeah, I had a burger today. That's awesome. Why isn't this capturing the correct window? There we go. There we go. Okay, wait. Coffee donations thing is showing up, but it's like really, it's being weird. Whatever. Just make it invisible for the stream. Solve that issue later. Alright, I was starting up the game. Wow, we got 8 viewers. Plus 9 a second ago. Don't worry about it. It's because I ate one of them. I got hungry. War stream. Game capture, Celeste, there we go. There we go. At some point I should make new portrait sprites for this mod. Look at that baby, 16,000 death. Compared to the measly 96. Oh boy.
Yummy Slurpee.
Oh, Slurpee. Yummy. Drinking my
Yummy
soda.
snack.
And my own snack. Incidentally, these are really good. For like, they're like dry biscuits. They're very good for clearing out my mouth with like sticky saliva bullshit, which is good for reading. Oh my god, unfinished sprites. I'm gonna skip cutscenes again. Who cares? Who cares about Theo anyway? A stream isn't about men. Madeline breaking free. And we're here. Oh my god, I almost died just there. What's the snack? I'm eating these, they're called digestives, which is a shitty name because they're pretty nice. But they're fairly plain cookies, but I kind of like them anyways. They're really nice for like dipping into tea. Oh! Oh! Oh. Oh, damn it. I'm being really careful. I remember the opening bits of this chapter are fairly easy. Usually when I die here, I die completely by accident. As opposed to the other points where I die on purpose, of course. Oh, this place is all the secrets. Ah, there we go. Reading time! Get my mouse in order. There we go. Right. She was talking about how Western authors talk about trans people worldwide. That is until she gets into the chapter titled Transsexualism. Here she seems to go into diatribe mode, describing transsexuals as a medical invention, were shaped by Western doctors and psychologists' stereotyped view of gender. Nanda goes on to make the broader point that transsexuals, far from being an example of gender diversity, both reflected and reinforced the dominant Euro-American sex-gender ideology, in which one had to choose to be either a man or a stereotypical woman. For Nana to make this sort of blanket generalization when there are countless examples of transsexuals who were involved in the early days of the gay rights and the lesbian feminist movements, or who are at the forefront of today's transgender and genderqueer movements, suggests that either she is completely ignorant of the existence of any transsexuals who do not fit her stereotype, or she purposefully ignores or discounts them in order to create the false impression that all transsexuals are stamped from the same establishment cookie cutter. Nanda's motives for painting such a rigid and distorted picture of transsexuals becomes obvious in the following chapter, Transgenderism. Despite the fact that virtually all organizations and communities that call themselves transgender generally include transsexuals, Nanda has somehow taken it upon herself to redefine transgender in opposition to transsexual. She describes transgenderism as being based on the principle of androgyny, explaining that unlike transsexuals, transgender people do not limit themselves to a single gender. Oh my god. It seems rather obvious why she is so determined to deny the overlap between these two groups. A running theme throughout the book is that transgender people who are defined as being separate from female and male necessarily challenge our Western assumptions that the male-female binary gender system is natural. Transsexuals complicate this issue by the virtue of the fact that we are gender variant yet typically identify within the binary. By dismissing us as medical invention that upholds the status quo of the binary sex-gender system, Nanda seems to be establishing a gender binary of her own, one in which third gender, androgynous, and visibly queer people who blur distinction between female and male are considered radical and natural, while those who identify as or appear to be clearly female or male are considered conservative and contrived. This radical conservative gender binary is also forwarded by Will Roscoe, an anthropologist who has focused much of his research on reconstructing the lives of what he refers to as the Berdashes, a Western umbrella term for Native American gender variant people. From the historical record. As a strict social constructionist, Roscoe refuses to believe that Berdashe status is merely a compromise between nature and culture or a niche to accommodate natural variation. He also denounces the view held by many anthropologists that some Berdashes crossed genders from male to female or female to male, because they could then be interpreted as upholding heterosexist gender system. Because Roscoe is determined to demonstrate that Native American Berdashes represent third genders, he plays up the ways in which these groups showed signs of being separate from and or mixed female or male. Ooh. He plays up the ways in which these groups showed signs of being separate from and or a mix of female and male, while playing down evidence that some Berdashes may have actually seen themselves as, or wanted to be, the other gender. While it is not difficult to do for certain Berdashes, as these rules varied significantly between Native American nations, Roscoe sticks to his third gender hypothesis even when analyzing the historical record of the Mojave Aliyah MTF spectrum and Huame FGM spectrum. Berdashes, reviewed in his 1994 essay How to Become a Berdashe, despite the fact that the Aliyah insisted on being referred to by female names and with female gender preferences, used the Mojave word for clitoris to refer to their penises, received female facial tattoos, and took part in rituals where they simulated pregnancy, Roscoe still argues that they should be considered third gender because they were given a unique name, i.e. Aliyah, Aliha, to distinguish them from other women. Oh boy. Let me get rid of this junk on my desk real quick. There we go. There we go. Other evidence that Roscoe uses to undermine the Mojave Berdashe's self-identified gender is that they were not always fully accepted in that gender by other Mojaves. He references accounts of individual Mojaves commenting that Aliha were less womanly than other women and cites rare occasions when some Mojaves use pronouns that reference the Berdash's birth rather than identified sex. Thus, to make his point that Mojave Berdashes represent third genders, Roscoe resorts to giving more credence to the judgments of non-gender variant Mojave than to the way that Aliha and Huane saw themselves. Perhaps this shouldn't be a surprise, as Roscoe himself purposely uses inappropriate pronouns and favors birth sex over identified sex when writing about Berdashes. The dichotomy that Nanda and Roscoe attempt to make between third genders and trans people who cross from one gender to the other seems rather dubious. After all, some people who are members of non-Western third gender traditions do identify fully as the other sex and or choose to physically transition when given the opportunity. Furthermore, as a Western transsexual, I may identify squarely within the male-female gender binary if I want to. But once other people discover my transsexual status, they usually start slipping up on pronouns and referring to me as MTF, boy girl, she or she he, or a she male. In other words, people try to third gender me. Both Roscoe and Nanda seem to have so much Both Roscoe and Nanda seem to have so much invested in promoting the theoretical significance of third genders that they're oblivious to the many ways in which these categories, rather than shattering the gender binary, may actually contribute to its stabilization by marking and segregating those people who have exceptional gender inclinations from gender-normative women and men. If you want to convince me that a culture truly has multiple genders that are dissociated from binary sex, show me one where male and female-bodied people are both included in every gender category. So long as third genders are composed of only male-bodied people with feminine qualities and female-bodied people with masculine qualities, it is hard for me to see such designations as anything other than oppositional sexist attempts by society to marginalize gender-variant people. It's so weird that binary trans people get third-gendered, and people who actually identify outside the binary are also not taken seriously. Anything to enforce that people aren't allowed to define their own non-cisgender, I guess. Yeah. Oh boy. Like, it happens in, like, Western cultures as well, obviously. Um, but, like, the specific way it's done in these examples with foreign cultures and foreign definitions and such is really interesting to me, right? Oh, fuck. Oh boy. Basically, it feels like people aren't allowed um in this system to define their genders for themselves. Right? We have to defer to how other people refer to them, and we should tell them what they are in some way, right? Like binary trans people are almost universally like placed in some weird third gender category, especially trans feminine people. And the people outside the binary are considered some form of delusion, right? Okay. Unfortunately, the mistaken notion that some genders are inherently more radical or subversive than others, which is seen throughout much of the anthropological literature on third genders, has also flourished throughout the social sciences, in women's and gender studies departments, and the humanities in general. I do see these cultural examples used still to argue that being non-binary is natural, but it does ignore how the people actually identified. Yeah, like I'm sure there's people within these categories that we would consider non-binary, neither male nor female, but largely when people talk about Hisha as being some kind of third gender, no. Most of them are trans women. They describe themselves as, women because they are women, right? But from a Western perspective, we have to place them in some kind of third category, right? Women's and gender studies departments and the humanities in general. And in the social constructionist's radical/conservative gender binary, no group is more regularly discredited and maligned than transsexuals. We are often portrayed as gender sellouts, and our attempts to live as and or physically transition to our identified sex are often misread as being driven not by our own intrinsic inclinations, but by a desire to quote-unquote fit in or assimilate into gender normalcy. Such misconceptions are evident in the following series of quotes. God. There's this really weird idea that some, slightly progressive people have that, being a trans woman is somehow, a type of gender conformity. And I don't know where they get that idea. That's ridiculous. I don't know where they get that idea. Transsexualism is a response to the rigid, socially prescribed gender dichotomy of heterosexual men and women. Frank Lewis, 1995. The idea is that societal pressure leads the transsexual to surmount the problem by changing the body to fit the norm of dichotomous gender. David E. Grimm, 1987. Transsexual patients have an excessively narrow image of what constitutes sex-appropriate behavior, where the notions of masculinity and femininity were the notions of masculinity and femininity less rigid, sex change operations should be unnecessary. Margaret Eichler, 1980. Sex change surgery is profoundly conservative in that it reinforces sharply contrasting gender roles by shaping individuals to fit them. Germaine Greer. Oh, fuck, I think I've heard that name. Hearing a name and recognizing it is like a red flag to me. The whole trans people are reinforcing gender stereotypes talking point. Yeah. Like, what's fucking bizarre to me is that, in my view, I don't think there's a way to be transgender and gender conforming at the same time, right? You might say a feminine trans girl is gender conforming in that she's a girl and she's feminine, but the fact that she is trans, the fact that she fully denounced being a man, is itself a radical gender nonconformity. If she were gender conforming, she would still be a fucking man, right? Come on. People just don't really wrap their heads around what gender conformity actually means in a society that hates trans people. It's fucking bizarre to me. While transsexuals may be deviants in terms of cultural norms about how one arrives at being a man or a woman, they are, for the most part, highly conformist about what to do once you get there. Judith Shapiro, 1991. These names are a hit list, by the way. I'm killing them. Ironically, transsexuals wish to be women, but end up approximating men's sexual conservatism. Most can still be typified as the Uncle Toms of the sexual liberation movement in sharp contrast with other sexual minorities. Thomas Kando, you bitch-ass motherfucker. 1974. Oh my god. The implication that transsexuals transition in order to hide their exceptional gender expression and/or sexual orientation is only made possible by the social constructionist practice of dumbing down gender to exclude subconscious sex. This exclusion is notable since virtually all transsexuals describe experiencing a profound, inexplicable, intrinsic self-knowing regarding their own gender. Because such accounts of transsexual subconscious sex/gender identity are nearly ubiquitous, one can only conclude that either the above critics have made their conclusions without bothering to read or listen to what transsexuals have said about their own lives and experiences, or they have chosen to ignore or discount such accounts, presumably out of an unwillingness to consider the possibility that trans people have an understanding about gender that cis-sexual academics do not. Trans women truly are the trans women of trans people. Like, okay, there's this pervasive idea around women and femininity in general that everything a woman does is in service to men in some way. The makeup, the dress, the outfit is all to attract men. The way she presents herself, the way she carries herself is all to attract men, right? And that's obviously bullshit. In this book, I'm noticing that some of the ways that people talk about trans women are actually very similar in that regard. The idea that a trans woman somehow is being a man's idea of a woman, right? This, it just will not shut up. It's always a men, isn't that? Okay, I'm gonna give this one more try, and if I die again, I'm just gonna leave this room. Oh. No! Okay. Not only do these transsexual as assimilationist accusations blatantly dismiss transsexual perspectives, but they are also unabashedly cis-sexist in other ways. They erase the existence of the many transsexuals who are unrelenting feminists and queer activists, and hold those transsexuals who identify as heterosexual feminine women and masculine men more accountable for gender-based oppression than the overwhelming majority of cis-sexual people who identify the same way. Another dehumanizing tactic used by these academic critics is the assumption that they are capable of fully understanding and speaking authoritatively about transsexuality, despite the fact that they are not transsexual themselves. In fact, rarely do they get to know any transsexuals personally. When Shapiro, Nanda, Grimm, and Eichler speak disparagingly about transsexuals, their arguments rely almost entirely on other people's research. Hausman boasts about attending one transgender conference and then liberally and extensively quotes from transsexual autobiographies without any consideration given to the role that non-trans book publishers and audiences play in deciding which transsexual stories get told and which do not. I attended one transgender conference. I'm an ally. Me when I'm an ally. Those sociologists who do base their critiques on interviews with transsexuals seem to have no qualms about drawing firm conclusions despite the many caveats inherent in their research. They generally rely on pathetically small sample sizes from the same geographic location, and their sample populations consist of trans people from similar middle-class economic dispositions who are all in the earliest stages of their transition. Was at the conference that type of was the conference the type of situation where there's one trans rep and it was a trans man? I don't know. I don't know. I hear about that a lot though, where it's like, oh, it's trans inclusive and it's only trans masculine people, right? It happens a lot apparently. This latter point is particularly salient, as perspectives of transsexuals who are in the process of actively managing their physical transitions and other people's reactions to those changes tend to differ greatly from those who have already been living in their identified sex for a number of years. Further, many sociologists make the common mistake of deriving their sample populations from patients at gender identity clinics, GICs. While such clinics may seem a boon for sociologists, as they provide a rare place where one can find a relatively large number of transsexuals, they are also likely to provide the most biased research population. GICs are notorious for enforcing particularly strict oppositional and traditional sexist norms for their trans patients. Thus, research populations derived entirely from GICs have already been selected for those transsexuals who are most able or willing to conform to sexual expectations regarding gender. Further, because GICs regularly carry out research on transsexuals, sociologists who construct interviews in association with GICs are likely to be viewed by the transsexual as part of the gatekeeper establishment. As a result, the sociologist will likely receive pat and predictable answers to their interview questions. Um, ah. Oh no, there was a thing there. Fuck. I don't think it's a strawberry. It's like one of those secret rooms that I'm not gonna figure out again. I don't think there's anything there. Oh yeah, it is one of the secret rooms. Yeah, fuck this. I have beef with the puzzles in Celeste. I don't think they're very good. The riddle. Yeah, they're more riddles than puzzles, usually. Is there something up here? That room is especially bullshit. Yeah, I don't know. It relies on figuring out an earlier puzzle, which is one of the easier puzzles to figure out. I will say that. There's other puzzles I have beef with. one of them basically requires you, like, understanding something that feels like a glitch. Just, like, figure that out, bitch. I think this is where, like, a split path comes in. And then this is one of the harder parts. I'm so good at this fucking game. Ah. Something here? I'm not finding any strawberries. Maybe I'm just dumb, but I don't want to get a pencil and paper to continue to complete a video game. Yeah. It's like the only thing in Celeste that's like it as well. It just doesn't feel particularly compelling. It's the type of shit where, like, at some point I'm just like, well, I guess I can ask the internet. Oh! Jesus. Ah. The whole thing with this chapter is basically that it's like it revolves around split paths for like this part. And there's a top path that's harder, and there's a bottom path that's easier. Luckily, I'm so fucking good at this game. Never mind. Okay. Because transsexuals often have to submit themselves to the rigorous interrogation of gatekeepers and constantly have to explain and justify their existence to a reluctant cis-sexual public, many are wary and suspicious of any cis-sexual, whether gatekeeper or academic, who wishes to turn trans people into research subjects. This reluctance is evident in the vast difference between the conclusions of superficial sociological interviews and those where the interviewers worked to gain the transsexual's trust, such as in the work of Anne Boleyn and Vivian K. Namaste? Boleyn's study is particularly telling because she starts out with a small and biased sample population similar to that which many sociologists rely on. The bulk of her data come from 12 members of the same transgender support group, all of whom were in the early stages of transitioning. However, because she got to know these trans women over several years and eventually gained their trust, she got to see a very different perspective on the trans female experience. Contrary to the stereotype of transsexuals as hyperfeminine, reveling in traditional notions of womanhood to a greater extent than genetic women, the transsexuals in this population were not admirers of stereotypical womanhood. They were keenly aware of the feminist movement and wanted careers as well as someone to share their lives with. and represented styles of dressing as diverse as the female population emulated. Trans women invented fashion, I think. Trans women and black people. If more academics would actually get to know transsexuals as people, rather than as mere research subjects, they would find that the assumption that we transition in order to fit into the gender binary as virtually no... Ooh. They would find that the assumption that we transition in order to fit into the gender binary has virtually no relevance in most transsexuals' lives. For many of us, the decision to transition comes after years of successfully passing as normal members of our assigned sex. For us, transitioning entails the complete antithesis of trying to fit in. Those of us who are attracted to members of our identified sex transition despite the fact that we will no longer be considered heterosexual. The variation in our expression ensures that some of us will be considered somewhat masculine women or feminine men after our transitions. And all transsexuals run the risk of being unable to physically pass, in the short term or the long term, in our identified sex upon transitioning.
Yummy Slurpee.
Yummy Slurpee.
Yummy Snack.
I'll have a few more. Okay. Give me a moment. I'm still chewing. Okay. Perhaps the most condescending aspect of the transsexual as assimilationist argument is that it presumes that transsexuals are accepted by society more than cissexuals who are queer in other ways, i.e. because of their gender expression or sexual orientation. This is most certainly not the case. As someone who has spent a chunk of her life as a relatively quote-unquote out male crossdresser, and later as an androgynous bigendered boy, I have found that people on average were extraordinarily more tolerant of and comfortable with my gender status back then. I have found that people on average were extraordinarily more tolerant of and comfortable with my gender status back then than they are now when I tell them I'm transsexual. And if you ask other transsexuals, even those who were out and proud queers prior to transition, but they didn't choose to transition earlier in their lives, most will tell you that they feared the social ramifications that come with transitioning. Being disowned by family and community, losing a job, being considered undesirable in the eyes of others, having one's identified gender constantly questioned by others. Not only is sex reassignment just about the most stigmatized medical procedure that exists in our society, but transsexuals themselves are rarely accepted culturally and legally as legitimate men or women. It is safe to say that lesbians and gay men are far more accepted and respected by the straight mainstream than transsexuals are. Thus, the idea that a trans person would transition in order to conform to heterosexist gender norms is nothing more than an illogical and disrespectful farce. It seems to me that the entire debate in academia over whether transsexuals are radical or conservative with regard. Are transsexuals radical or conservative? Let's find out. It seems to me that the entire debate in academia over whether transsexuals are radical or conservative with regards to gender is founded on cissexual privilege. Because these scholars have not had to live with the reality of gender dissonance, they are afforded the luxury of intellectualizing away subconscious sex. Thus allowing them to project their own interests or biases onto trans people. Not surprisingly, the researchers' academic backgrounds seem to be the primary determinant as to what explanations for transsexuality they will posit. Being that Harriet Benjamin, who has trained as an endocrinologist, believed that transsexuality was caused by fetal hormone levels, and Richard Green, Robert Stoller, and John Money, all trained in psychology, motherfuckers, looked to relationships with parents and or events that occurred during one's formative years as its primary cause. It is not surprising that social scientists generally argue that transsexuality is the result of societal gender norms. Lesbian and gay scholars claim it is the result of heterosexism. Feminists blame it on patriarchy, and post-structuralists simply deconstruct it into non-existence. John Money. Yeah, apparently that's a real person's name. Crazy, I know. I'll do the easy route. This is worse. Let's do it. Fuck yes! He's like infamous as fuck, really? I haven't heard of him before I started reading this book. Fuck! Jesus. Okay, let's look up who John Money is real quick. On my other tab, which you're not allowed to look at. Oh boy. This Wikipedia article is marked red with Shinigami eyes. Awesome. It's from New Zealand. John William Money. Known for his research on human sexual behavior and gender. Money advanced the use of more accurate terminology in sex research, coining the terms gender role and sexual orientation. Despite widespread popular belief, Money did not coin the term gender identity. Money pioneered drug treatment for sex offenders to extinguish their sex drives. John Money, what the fuck? Since the 1990s, Money's work and research has been the subject to significant academic and public scrutiny. Yeah, I can imagine. Oh my god. Punitive justice is one hell of a fucking drug, you know that? You know what? Oh, yes. We should treat sex offenders by fucking castrating them somehow or whatever. That's fun. Normal. Surely this will solve sex crimes. A 1997 academic study criticized Money's work in many respects, particularly in regards to the involuntary sex reassignment of the child David Premier. Money allegedly coerced David and his brother Brian to perform sexual rehearsal with each other. Huh? Which Money then photographed. David Reimer lived a troubled life, ending with his suicide at 38. At 38, following his brother's suicide. Money believed that transgender people had an idée fixe. And established the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1965. He screened adult patients for 2 years prior to granting them medical transition and believed sex roles should be de-stereotyped so that masculine women would be less likely to desire transition. Money is generally viewed as a negative figure by the transgender community. I can't imagine why. Money's writing has been translated into many languages and includes around 20,000 articles. Not 20,000, 2,000 articles, books, chapters, and reviews. He received around 65 honors, awards, and degrees in his lifetime. Oh, thank fuck he's dead. Died July 7th, 2006. Okay, that was just like the top part of the Wikipedia article. Jesus fucking Christ. Fuck this guy. Let's read the actual book. One William and Money. Moving beyond cis-sexist models of transsexuality. In the last 50 years of sexological and sociological discourses regarding transsexuality have been nothing more than a charade, where the opinions of those who have academic and clinical credentials always trump those of transsexuals themselves, where trans people are treated as nothing more than blank slates for cis-sexual gender researchers to inscribe their pet theories upon. And while researchers in the humanities often frame their work as being in opposition to that of the gatekeepers, it seems to me that the similarities between both groups far outweigh the differences. Both clinicians and academics are obsessed with meticulously documenting and subcategorizing the transgender population. Both display the ephemomaniac compulsion of focusing primarily on MTF spectrum trans people, and both view transsexuals as anomalies that require explanation and justification rather than viewing us as a part of human diversity that just simply exists. The needs, desires, and perspectives of transsexuals have become lost in a shameful tug-of-war between those who wish to show that stereotypical gender differences arise naturally from biological predisposition, and those who wish to demonstrate that those same gender differences are entirely socially constructed. As a transsexual, my lived experiences are at odds with both strict gender essentialist and social constructionist accounts of gender. And while the idea that gender is a combination of many things, some biological and others sociological, does not make for a catchy soundbite or a sexy hook for one's book or thesis, it appears to me to be indisputable. And maybe once most sexologists and sociologists finally come to accept this fact, they will stop exploiting and dissecting the lives of transgender people and others who have exceptional gender inclinations and sex characteristics. If there is anything to be learned from sexological and sociological accounts of transsexuality, it is that cissexism, i.e., the tendency to hold transsexual genders to a different standard than cissexual ones, runs rampant not only among the general public, but also throughout the medical and psychiatric establishments and in the ivory towers of academia. We are the crystal gems. Ooh. No! Nah! Oh. That didn't take long. We'll always save the day. And if you think we can't, we'll always find a way. Should rewatch Steven Universe at some point. God. God, I love that show. I'm so fucking glad that I, like, sort of grew up with that. If sociologists really wanted to better understand transsexuality, rather than focus exclusively on the behaviors and ideology of transsexuals. Jesus. Rather than focus exclusively on the behaviors and ideology of transsexuals, they would study the irrational animosity, fear, and disrespect that many cissexuals express towards trans people, and others with exceptional genders and sexual traits. If sexologists were truly interested in transsexuals' mental and physical well-being, they would not try to micromanage our transitions, but rather focus their energies on correcting the huge disparity that exists between cissexual and transsexual access to gender-related healthcare. If the gatekeepers' failure to adequately advocate on behalf of their trans patients that has allowed US insurance companies, which regularly cover the cissexual hormone replacement therapy, genital and breast reconstruction, and procedures to enhance or enable cissexual fertility and sexuality, to get away with denying coverage for similar treatments for transsexuals. And the popular stereotype that transsexuals are crazy, that our identified genders are merely the product of overactive imaginations and not to be taken seriously, is also the result of the same medically and psychiatry-sanctioned double standards. While cissexuals are free to choose from hundreds of different types of surgical body modifications without being pathologized or requiring anyone else's permission, procedures required for transsexuals to lead full and healthy lives are singled out for gatekeeper approval and an accompanying diagnosis of gender identity disorder. Despite the recent civil rights progress that has accompanied the rise of transgender activism since the 1990s, the gatekeeper model of transsexuality still dominates in the United States, while the HBIGDA, God, this will never fucking roll off the tongue, has slightly liberalized its standards of care in recent years. It still requires transsexuals to gain psychiatric approval in order to gain access to hormones, obtain surgery, and change their legal sex. This system is inherently cissexist, as it requires trans people to accommodate and appease the gender presumptions of individual therapists who potentially harbor traditional sexist, oppositional sexist, and or cissexist biases in order to have our identified genders recognized. It's time we replace the existing gatekeeper model with one that's centered on the needs of trans people themselves. This begins with the public acknowledgement that all people have a right to self-identify, even if that identity falls outside the male-female binary, and that one's self-identified gender is necessarily more legitimate than the one that is rather negatively and that one's self-identified gender is necessarily more legitimate than the one that is rather naively assigned to them by others. Okay. Gaming. Oh my god, I almost died there. I think there's like an Easter egg here somewhere. Oh my god. Ah! What the fuck? Oh, yo, 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 yo. Further, the process of socially and legally changing one's sex should be entirely uncoupled from medicine and psychiatry. No specific medical procedure should be required for one to have one's identified sex recognized, nor should any medical or psychiatric professional have the authority to prevent someone from living in their identified sex. Those trans people who feel that they need to hormonally or physically transition in order to ease their gender dissonance should be allowed that option if they wish. In the same way that cissexuals ultimately choose for themselves whether or not to undergo hormone replacement therapy, genital or breast reconstruction, fertility and sexuality-related procedures, etc. The idea that trans people should decide for themselves whether or not to physically transition, what some have disdainfully referred to as sex change on demand. God, I wish that was real. I wish that was real. Has been opposed by the gatekeeper establishment from the beginning. The most common argument is that the system, as it stands, acts as a safeguard to prevent people who are not transsexual, e.g. cissexuals who are merely embarrassed or confused about their atypical sexuality, or who exhibit delusional or antisocial behavior, from undergoing potentially irreversible medical procedures. The Sex Change on Demand would be a banger album title. True. Once again, such practices reveal the cis-sexist biases of the gatekeepers. Trans people are denied immediate treatment of their gender dissonance in order to protect the well-being of a rather small minority of cissexuals. One can only imagine how furious and frustrated most cissexuals would feel if they had to undergo psychotherapy for 3 to 6 months. So that the psychiatrist could rule out the possibility that they were transsexual before obtaining permission to undergo hormone replacement therapy or gender-related surgeries they required. Great band name too. You're right, you're right. Sex change on demand, straight at your doorstep. Like a fucking advertising sex change on demand, like those fucking, what are they called? Infomercials. The gatekeeper's fear of sex change on demand rings particularly hollow in a world where most trans people cannot even afford to take the medically and psychiatrically sanctioned route to transition. Psychotherapy is prohibitively expensive for those who do not have adequate insurance. Many trans people rely on underground markets and overseas pharmacies to obtain affordable hormones without a prescription. Many undergo sex reassignment surgeries in countries like Thailand, where it is much less expensive and where there are fewer restrictions than in the United States. Clearly, gatekeeper micromanagement of transitioning has only served to force a significant percentage of trans people who either cannot afford to follow the HBIGDA standards of care or fail to convince their therapists that they are true transsexuals out of the system. We should have sex change on demand. I think that would be good. Gender affirmation surgeries. God, what am I fucking doing? There's like some pointless secret up there that's like a reference or something. I don't know why I want to go there. Those gatekeepers who believe that they alone should have the authority to determine who should and should not be allowed to transition.
Yummy snack.
Ooh, I'll do that after reading. Those gatekeepers who believe that they alone should have the authority to determine who should and should not be allowed to transition ignore the obvious fact that gender dissonance has always been a self-diagnosed condition. There are no visible signs or tests for it. I will also do that after reading. Only the trans people can feel and describe it. Once we make the arduous decision to transition, letting go of other people's perception of us in favor of being true to ourselves, there is really nothing anyone can do to stop us. For these reasons, medical and mental health professionals should turn their attention away from regulating sex reassignment and towards facilitating the safe access to the means of transitioning. We must seize the means of transition. Thankfully, some have already begun working towards this goal, designing programs that provide trans people with affordable access to information, hormones, and the appropriate medical tests to ensure a safe transition. Fuck yeah. Others in the field of psychiatry have similarly advocated that mental health professionals move away from the gatekeeper model. Move away from the gatekeeper model and toward one focused on helping the transsexual manage the emotional stress and obstacles they are faced with when transitioning. While all of these changes represent a promising start, true equality for transsexuals and transgender people will remain elusive as long as gender variance remains pathologized by the American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the DSM. Human beings show a large range of gender and sexual diversity, so there is no legitimate reason for any form of cross-gender behavior or identity to be categorized as a mental disorder. That being said, I also take issue with those who argue for completely decriminalizing? For completely demedicalizing transsexuality, or who advocate removing GID from the DSM, without first ensuring that there are provisions in place to allow people who choose to transition affordable access to transsexual-related medical procedures. Some have suggested creating a medical diagnosis for transsexuality to replace the current psychiatric diagnosis of GID. This makes sense, being that most transsexuals feel that our problem lies not with our minds, but with our bodies. Once these medical provisions are in place, the importance of psychiatrically depathologizing transgenderism cannot be underestimated. After all, it is the popular misconception that gender variance constitutes a mental illness. The transsexual and transgender people are the ones who have the problem that enables cissexual and cisgender prejudice against us. There we go. A yummy treat. I really want to live in the world where a person can just like go on hormones just to try it out for funsies. And then maybe they find out it's not for them and it doesn't matter. Okay. He's groovy and never glooby. Dismantling cissexual privilege. Until now, discourses on transsexuality have invariably relied on language and concepts invented by clinicians, researchers, and academics who have made transsexuals the objects of their inquiry. In such a framework, transsexual bodies, identities, and perspectives and experiences are continuously required to be explained and inevitably remain open to interpretation. Corresponding cissexual attributes are simply taken for granted. They are assumed to be natural and normal, and therefore escape reciprocal critique. This places transsexuals at a constant disadvantage, since we have generally been forced to rely on limiting cissexual-centric terminology to make sense of our own lives. In recent years, the rise of transgender activism has provided a new paradigm for understanding the experiences of the gender-variant population, of which transsexuals are a subset. According to this model, gender-variant people are oppressed by a system that forces everyone to identify and be easily recognizable as either a woman or a man. This perspective has led to transgender activists to primarily focus their attention on opposing binary gender norms, particularly those that place limitations on one's gender expressions and appearance, and to celebrate and create cultural space for those who defy, transcend, or fail to identify within the male-female binary. While transgender activism has undoubtedly benefited the transsexual community in many ways, it has also made invisible many of our distinct issues and experiences. And to a large extent, this is because transgender rhetoric favors the perspectives of those who identify outside the male-female binary, whereas most transsexuals typically identify within it. And those whose gender expression and appearance does not conform to the binary, whereas transsexuals typically cite the discrepancy between the subconscious sex and physical sex as the major obstacle in their lives. Okay, mini chapter, I guess. Fuck it, let's just keep reading. While I believe that creating space for people who exist outside of the male-female binary remains a cause worth fighting for, those of us who are transsexual must begin to simultaneously develop our own language and concepts that accurately articulate our experiences, our unique experiences and perspectives, and fill in the many gaps that exist in both gatekeeper and transgender activist language. I contend that this work should begin with a thorough critique of cissexual privilege. That is, the double standard that promotes the idea that transsexual genders are distinct from and less legitimate than cissexual genders. Before describing how cissexual privilege is practiced and justified, we must address two under-acknowledged yet crucial aspects of social gender that enable cissexual privilege to proliferate, yet remain invisible: gendering and cissexual assumption. Ah, damn it. Gendering. Most of us want to believe that the act of distinguishing between women and men is a passive task, that all people naturally fall into one of two mutually exclusive categories, male and female, and that we observe these natural states in an unobtrusive, objective manner. However, this is not the case. Distinguishing between women and men is an active process, and we do it compulsively. If you have any doubt about this, simply observe how quickly you determine other people's genders. It happens instantaneously. Not only that, but we tend to make the call one way or another, no matter how far away a person is or how little evidence we have to go by. While many like to think of ourselves as being passive observers, in reality we are constantly and actively projecting our ideas and assumptions about maleness and femaleness onto every person we meet. And all of us do it. Whether we are cissexual or transsexual, straight as an arrow or queer as a $3 bill. What is this about $3 bills? I call this process of distinguishing between females and males gendering, to highlight the fact that we actively and compulsively assign genders to all people based on usually just a few visual and audio cues. Recognizing the ubiquitous nature of this phenomenon calls into question most definitions of gender itself. We can argue all we want about what defines a woman or a man, whether it's genes, chromosomes, brain structure, genitals, socialization, or the legal sex on a birth certificate or a driver's license. But the truth is, these factors typically play no role whatsoever in how we gender people in everyday circumstances. Typically, we rely primarily on secondary sex characteristics, body shape and size, skin complexion, facial and body hair, voice, breasts, etc. To a lesser extent, gender expression and gender roles, person's gests, mannerisms, etc. I will refer to the gender we are assigned by other people as our perceived sex, or perceived gender. A major reason the act of gendering remains invisible to most people is that, in the vast majority of cases, our assessment of a person's gender tends to be in agreement with that person's gender identity and the gender assignments made by other people. If the genders we assign to individuals regularly differ from the assignments made by other people, the guesswork inherent in gendering would come far more obvious to us. Oh my god. Something about this chapter makes me want to, like, beat it really fast. And it's really fun to do. Ah, it's a short page. However, as a transsexual, I have been in numerous situations, particularly during my transition, where two or more people simultaneously came to different conclusions regarding my perceived gender. That is, one person assumed that I was female, while another assumed that I was male. Such instances demonstrate the speculative nature of gendering. I have also found that people's experiences and preconceptions about gender dramatically affect the way they gender other people. For example, back when I identified as a male cross-dresser, I found that I could pass, quote-unquote, as a woman rather easily in suburban areas. But in cities where people were presumably more aware of the existence of gender-variant people, I would often be, quote-unquote, read as a cross-dressed male. Most cis-sexuals remain oblivious to the subjective nature of gendering, primarily because they themselves have not regularly had the experience of being misgendered, i.e., mistakenly assigned a gender that does not match one's identified gender. Unfortunately, this lack of experience usually leads cis-sexuals to mistakenly believe that the process of gendering is a matter of pure observation, rather than the act of speculation it is. What's with all these tiny, tiny chapters suddenly? Little babies, little baby chapters. I think I am gonna call a break soon-ish. Oy, 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 oy. Ah, what the hell? What even happened there? You're the baby chapters. Cissexual assumption. The second process that enables cissexual privilege is cissexual assumption. This occurs when a cissexual makes the common, albeit mistaken, assumption that the way they experience their physical and subconscious sexes, i.e., the fact that they do not feel uncomfortable with the sex they were born into, i.e., the fact that they do not feel uncomfortable with the sex they were born into, nor do they think of themselves as or wish they could become the other sex, applies to everyone else in the world. In other words, the cissexual indiscriminately projects their cissexuality onto all other people, thus transforming cissexuality into a human attribute that is taken for granted. There is an obvious analogy to heterosexual assumption here. Most cissexuals assume that everyone they meet is also cissexual, just as most heterosexuals assume that everyone they meet is also heterosexual, unless of course they are provided with evidence to the contrary. While cissexual assumption remains invisible to most cissexuals, those of us who are transsexual are excruciatingly aware of it. Prior to our transitions, we find that the cissexual majority simply assumes that we fully identify as members of our assigned sex, thus making it difficult for us to manage our gender difference and to be open about the way we see ourselves. And after our transitions, many of us find that the cissexual majority simply assumes that we have always been members of our identified sex, thus making it impossible for us to be open about our trans status without constantly having to come out to others. Thus, while most cissexuals are unaware that cissexual assumption even exists, those of us who are transsexual recognize it as an active process that erases trans people and their experiences. I feel like this whole idea of like people being assumed to be cisgender also kind of applies to people who like don't know yet, right? I feel like this vaguely can tie back into like egg discourse a little bit. I watched like half of an awful video essay about like what's his fucking name? Kurt Cobain, and Kurt Cobain having or potentially being trans feminine, right? And I don't know. I feel like there's this assumption that, like, being cisgender is normal, expected, fine, the default, right? And suggesting that someone is trans, especially suggesting that someone might be trans feminine, is almost considered this type of violence, which I do not fully understand. I mean, I understand it. I understand why people think that, right? Cis until proven otherwise, right? People are cis until proven otherwise, and suggesting to someone that they might be trans is taken as, like, a type of violence. It's taken as, like, disrespect almost, right? And this awful, awful video essay that I watched that I will not recommend basically suggested that it was stereotyping because, oh, people just assume Kurt Cobain is feminine because, ooh, he liked wearing dresses, and that's stereotypical. It's the violence of implying they are non-normal, yeah. Pretty much. Was I about to read? I already forgot. No. I'm gaming. Cracking your own egg is also overcoming the idea that you're cis, because that's the default projected onto you, or at least that is in my experience. Yeah, like, from what I've heard, from what I understand from other trans people, they very much had to grapple with the idea that they are not cisgender, right? They had to overcome that at some point. And a lot of them will tell you, if someone had told me, or someone had told them, right, it was great. It helped them, you know, feel less of that pressure. That it was okay. Ah. Did I even repeat this part? Fuck, I can't remember. Jesus. My memory sucks. Okay, no, I did read that. This sexual gender entitlement. What a term. For most cis-sexuals, the fact that they feel comfortable inhabiting their own physical sex, and that other people conform this sense of naturalness by appropriating gendering... Fuck. And that other people confirm this sense of naturalness by appropriately gendering them, allows them to develop a sense of entitlement regarding their own gender. They feel entitled to call themselves a woman or a man. This is not necessarily a bad thing. However, because many of these same cissexuals also assume that they are infallible in their ability to assign genders to other people, they can develop an overactive sense of cissexual gender entitlement. I think we've talked about gender entitlement before. And gender entitlement is the idea that assuming that the way that it works for you is how it works for everyone, right? So, like, heterosexual entitlement would be assuming that everyone is straight, or, you know, a sort of homosexual entitlement would be that assuming that everyone is attracted to either men or women and never both, right? And then there's a lot of ways to have that kind of entitlement. And this is like the specific one they're discussing now. I just wanted to bring that back to a thing discussed earlier in the book. This goes beyond a sense of self-ownership regarding their own gender, and broaches territory in which they consider themselves to be the ultimate arbiters of which people are allowed to call themselves women or men. It's the assumption that you alone are infallible arbiter of gender. Yeah, cissexual gender entitlement specifically. Is that right? But they talked about gender entitlement and other forms of entitlement before in the book. Right. She at a certain point Julia Serano, give me my royalties. No. Um so Julia Serano also described like sort of non-binary gender entitlement. The idea that genders outside the male female binary are somehow more enlightened, more advanced than genders that are binary, right? Uh, this kind of gender entitlement is pervasive, and almost everyone has some form of it, a little bit, right? They are specifically currently talking about cissexual gender entitlement. Once again, most cissexuals are unaware of their gender entitlement because, one, the processes that enable it, i.e., gendering and sexual assumption, are invisible to them, and two, so long as they are cissexual and relatively gender normative, they have likely not been inconvenienced by the gender entitlement of others. Because gender entitled cissexuals assume that they have the ability and authority to accurately determine who is a woman and who is a man, they in effect grant a privilege, cissexual privilege, to those people whom they appropriately gender. To illustrate this point, imagine that I'm approached by someone who appears male to me, i.e., I gender them male. If they were to introduce themselves as Mr. Jones, I would probably extend them cissexual privilege. That is, I would respect their male identity and extend to them all of the privileges associated with their identified sex. I might call them Sir, grant them permission into male-only space, find it appropriate when they tell me they are married to a woman, etc. However, if I were gender entitled, there might be some instances in which I'd refuse to extend them the privileges associated with their identified sex. For example, if the person introduced themselves as Miss Jones, but I chose to view the gender I'd initially perceived them as, i.e., male, to be more authentic or legitimate than their female identity, I would be denying them cissexual privilege. Similarly, if I were to learn that Mr. Jones was transsexual and had been born female, and if that knowledge led me to regender them as female rather than male, I would again be denying him, in this case, cissexual privilege. Oh yeah. Oh my god, the one tiny little spike, really? Fuck. Okay, I'm gonna call a break time. There we go. Apparently I completely fucking forgot that I actually got chocolate muffins for stream on. Whoops. There we go. I also made sure that I wasn't fucking getting scammed with only one missing muffin or whatever. For some reason it happened last time. It was really weird. Missing one in the back. Right, I was about to read. Yeah. An excellent example of how gender entitlement produces cissexual privilege and how that privilege can be used to undermine transsexual genders can be found in the following Germaine Greer quote. No one ever asked women if they recognized sex-change males as belonging to their sex or considered whether being obliged to accept MTF transsexuals as women was at all damaging to their identity or self-esteem. The immediate sense that one gets after reading this quote, besides nausea, is Greer's severe sense of gender entitlement. Despite the fact that she knows that transsexual women identify as female, Greer refers to us instead as sex-change males, demonstrating that she feels entitled to gender us in whatever way she feels appropriate. Similarly, because her cissexual assumption, i.e. her belief that cissexuality is natural and goes without saying, she doesn't bother defining exactly what she means when she uses the word women. In her mind, it's a given that she is referring only to cissexual women. Greer grants these women cissexual privilege when she suggests that they, along with her, are equally entitled to be consulted about whether transsexual women are equally entitled to be... Wait. Greer grants these women cissexual privilege when she suggests that they, along with her, are equally entitled to be consulted about whether transsexual women should belong to their sex or not. It is particularly telling that Greer uses the word asked in this context. After all, nobody in our society ever asks for permission to belong to one gender or another. Rather, we just are who we are, and other people make assumptions about our gender accordingly. Thus, when Greer uses the word asked and obliged, she is not talking about whether trans women should be allowed to be female, but whether or not our femaleness should be respected and legitimized to the same extent as cissexual women's femaleness. By applying different standards of legitimacy to people's identified and lived genders, based on whether they are cissexual or transsexual, Greer is producing and exercising cissexual privilege. I'm going to very quickly go to Wikipedia and look up Germaine Greer, because I swear I've heard her name before. Oh god, she's Australian. Red name on Shinigami Eyes, very promising. Germaine Greer is an Australian writer and quote-unquote feminist, regarded as one of the major voices of the second wave feminist movement in the latter half of the 20th century. Oh, really? Really? Oh, she's important? That's fucking sad. Jesus. Greer's ideas have created controversy ever since her first book, The Female Eunuch, 1970s, made her a household name. An international bestseller and a watershed text in the feminist movement, it offered a systematic deconstruction of ideas such as womanhood and femininity, arguing that women were forced to assume submissive roles in society to fulfill male fantasies of what being a woman entailed. Okay, let's just control F. Trans. Surely there's some mention of critique from trans people. Transgender. Okay. In 1989 issue of The Independent, she published on why sex change is a lie, an essay in which she recalled a 1971 encounter with someone she perceived as a trans woman. She referred to this person as it and him and called her a gross parody of my sex who should not be allowed to come to the laboratory with me or possess a female passport. And said that when this person grabbed my head to say thank you, she did so with a paw with a rapist's grip. Hey, what's the verdict? Is this person a feminist or what? Oh my god. Oh, sickening person. Is she dead yet? She's not dead yet. Fuck. We fucked up as a society. Right, okay. Uh... No! Okay. And cissexuals are generally unaware that their gender entitlement arises from the acts of gendering and cissexual assumption. They often find themselves having to justify their belief that their gender is more legitimate or quote-unquote real than that of a transsexual. The most common... oh, I just, like, something shot into my throat or something. Okay, I'm good. The most common myth used to justify this cissexual privilege is the idea that cissexuals inherit the right to call themselves female or male by virtue of being born into that particular sex. I think this position has to be earned. We should fight for it. In other words, cissexuals view their gender entitlement as a birthright. This is often a deceitful act, as many, if not most cissexuals in our society tend to look disparagingly upon societies and cultures that still rely on class or caste systems, where one's occupation, social status, economic disposition, political power, etc., is predetermined based on the accident at birth. So while most Western cissexuals frown upon birth privilege as a means to determine these other forms of social class, they hypocritically embrace it when it comes to gender. Once a cissexual assumes that their gender entitlement is a birth privilege, it becomes easy for them to dismiss the legitimacy of transsexuals' identified and lived sex. After all, in their eyes, transsexuals are actively trying to claim for themselves a gender that they are not entitled to, having not been born into it. However, as a transsexual, I find it several obvious flaws with his birth privilege argument. First of all, the sex we are assigned at birth plays almost no role whatsoever in day-to-day human interactions. None of us need to carry our birth certificate around with us to prove what sex we were born into. And since I have been living as a woman, I have never had a single person ask me whether I was born a girl. Indeed, cissexual assumption essentially renders my birth sex irrelevant, as others will automatically assume that I was born female based solely on the fact that they have gendered me female. Oh my god. Okay. Gender-entitled cissexuals may try to claim that I am actively setting out to steal the sexual privilege by transitioning to and living as female. But the truth is that I don't have to. In fact, I have found that most cissexuals dole out cissexual privilege to complete and total strangers rather indiscriminately. Every time I walk into a store and someone asks, "How can I help you, ma'am?" they are extending me cissexual privilege. Every time I walk into a woman's restroom and nobody flinches or questions my presence, they're extending me cissexual privilege. However, because I am a transsexual, the cissexual privilege that I experience is not equal to that of a cissexual because it can be brought into question at any time. It is perhaps best described as conditional cissexual privilege, because it can be taken away from me and because it can be taken away from me and often is as soon as I mention or someone discovers that I am transsexual. Cissexuals may want to believe that their genders are more authentic than mine, but that belief is dishonest and ignorant. The truth is, cissexual women feel entitled to call themselves women because 1, they identify that way, 2, they live their lives as women, and 3, other people relate to them as women. All of these markers apply to transsexual womanhood. In the realm of social interactions, the only difference between my transsexual gender and their cissexual genders is that my femaleness is generally mischaracterized as second-rate, as illegitimate, as an imitation of theirs. And the major difference between my life history as a woman and theirs is that I have had to fight for my right to be recognized as female, while they have had the privilege of simply taking it for granted. It's very interesting, cool that she reframes passing as being granted conditional cissexual privilege. Yeah, that's how I've heard like passing described as well, as like the other end of the closet, right? Sure, you might pass as female, sure, you might be recognized as a woman 24/7 almost every day, but if someone knows that you are trans, that can just be taken away. They can just stop seeing you as a woman, right? And often they will. Oh my god, I like run straight into it every time, I swear.
Show me your belly.
Okay. Since you demanded it so nicely of me. Trans assimilation and ungendering. Because cissexuals have a vested interest in preserving
Yummy
their
snack.
After I'm done reading, okay? After I'm done reading. Because cis-sexuals have a vested interest in preserving their own sense of cis-sexual gender entitlement and privilege, they often engage in a constant and concerted effort to artificialize transsexual genders. A common strategy used to accomplish this goal is transfassimilation, viewing or portraying transsexual genders as facsimiles of cis-sexual genders. God, that's something I've noticed in this book as well. Like, the amount of times people claim that, like, trans women are simply imitating cis women, right? Bold assumption to make, actually. This strategy not only mischaracterizes transsexual genders as fake, but insinuates that cis-sexual genders are the primary, real version that the transsexual and cis. Oh, fucking hell, Jesus! Blah. This strategy not only mischaracterizes transsexual genders as quote-unquote fake, but I can talk. I swear I can talk. I can get through the sentence. This strategy not only mischaracterizes transsexual genders as quote-unquote fake, but insinuates that cis-sexual genders are the primary, real version that the transsexual merely copies. I did it! The tactic of transfassimilation is evident in the regularity with which cis-sexuals use the words such as emulate, imitate, mimic, and impersonate when describing transsexual identities and expression. It can also be seen in the way cis-sexual media producers tend to depict real or fictional transsexual characters in the act of affecting or practicing gender roles associated with their identified sex. These depictions of transsexuality as mere affectation undermine the very real inclinations and experiences that lead transsexuals to live as members of their identified sex in the first place. Further, they ignore the ways in which all people, whether transsexual or cissexual, observe and imitate others with regard to gender. For cissexuals, such imitation mostly occurs during childhood and adolescence, when they may emulate certain gender behaviors exhibited by a parent or older sibling of the same sex. Transsexual, this process often occurs later in life, at the period just before or during one's transition, in which cases, imitation is primarily a form of gender experimentation, with behaviors that the person feels comfortable with being retained over time. But those traits that feel awkward or incongruous with their sense of self eventually falling by the wayside. Once we recognize this, it becomes apparent that transfassimilation is a blatant double standard that ensures that acts of cis-sexual gender imitation will typically be overlooked, thus naturalizing their genders, while acts of transsexual gender imitation will be overemphasized, thus artificializing our genders. Chapters are pretty fucking interesting so far.
Yummy Slurpee.
Oh, right, I forgot to make me snack. Oh my god. Okay. Oh. There we go. Another way in which transsexual genders are often dismissed as quote-unquote fakes is by applying different standards of gendering to transsexuals and cisexuals. This practice is well illustrated by the following passage from Patrick Califia's book, Sex Changes. Recently, I had a very educational experience. I found out that one of my long-term women acquaintances is transgendered. Gulp. Given how much work I've done to educate myself about transsexuality, I didn't think it would make that much of a difference, but I found myself looking at her in a whole different way. Suddenly her hands looked too big. There was something odd about her nose, and didn't she have an Adam's apple? Wasn't her voice kind of deep for a woman? And wasn't she awfully bossy, just like a man? And my god, she had a lot of hair on her forearm. I found out that one of my long-term women acquaintances is transgendered. God, Jesus fucking Christ. Wasn't she awfully bossy, just like a man? That's just regular misogyny. That's just normal misogyny you're doing. Like, come the fuck on, man. God, I see that all the fucking time. How quickly trans women are seen as, like, aggressive when they're stating their opinions. It's just misogyny times 10. Califia goes on to say that this incident made him aware of the double standard that exists in the way transsexuals are often viewed. For example, when we presume a person to be cissexual, we generally accept their overall perceived gender as natural and authentic, while disregarding any minor discrepancies in their gender appearance. However, upon discovering or suspecting that a person is transsexual, we often actively and rather compulsively search for evidence of their assigned sex in their personality, expressions, and physical bodies. I have experienced this firsthand during the countless occasions when I have come out to people as transsexuals. Upon learning of my trans status, most people get this distinctive look in their eyes, as if they're suddenly seeing me differently, searching for clues of the boy that I used to be and projecting different meanings onto my body. I call this process ungendering, as it is an attempt to undo a trans person's gender by privileging incongruities and discrepancies in their gendered appearance that would normally be overlooked or dismissed if they were presumed to be cissexual. The only purpose that ungendering serves is to privilege cissexual genders, while delegitimizing the genders of transsexuals and other gender variant people. And all of this is oppositional misogyny. She has male qualities, yeah. Suddenly we're looking for all the male qualities a woman has when she comes out as trans, right? Oh, god damn it. Should have done a dash. Eating the rest of my muffin. Or at least taking another bite. Moving beyond bio boys and genetic girls. The first step we must take toward dismantling cissexual privilege is to purge those words and concepts from our vocabularies that foster the idea that cissexual genders are inherently more authentic than those of transsexuals. A good place to start is with the common tendency to refer to cissexuals as genetic or biological males and females. Despite its frequent occurrence, the use of the word genetic seems particularly strange to me, as we are unable to readily see other people's sex chromosomes. In fact, since so few people ever have their chromosomes examined, one could argue that the vast majority of people have a genetic sex that is yet to be determined. My gender, my sex, unknown. We don't know, we haven't checked yet. In the rare cases where people have their chromosomes checked out, such as sex testing at the Olympics or infertility clinics. Why did they do that at the Olympics? I forgot about that shit. Jesus fucking Christ. A person's genetic sex not matching their assigned sex occurs far more often than most people would ever fathom. Something's getting stuck on my mouse. It's like dragging a little bit. Okay. I think we're good. The use of the word biological and its abbreviation bio is just as impractical as the word genetic. Whenever I hear someone refer to cissexuals as being biological women and men, I usually interject that despite the fact that I am transsexual, I am not inorganic or non-biological in any way. If I press people to further define what they mean by biological, they'll often say that the word refers to people who have a fully functioning reproductive system for their sex. Well, if that's the case, then what about people who are infertile or who have their reproductive organs removed as a result of some medical condition? Are those people not biological men and women? People often insist that biological refers to someone's genitals, but I would ask them how many people's genitals have they seen up close? 10, 20, 100? And in the vast majority of instances where we meet somebody who's fully dressed and therefore their genitals are hidden, how do we know whether to refer to them as she or he? The truth is, when we see other people and classify them as either female or male, the only biological cues we typically have to go on are secondary sex characteristics, which are themselves the products of sex hormones. That being the case, as someone who has had estrogen in their system for 5 years now, shouldn't I be considered a biological woman? I think yes. I think absolutely yes. Oh my god. When you break it down like this, it becomes obvious that the words biological and genetic are mere stand-ins for the word that people really want to use. Natural. Most asexuals want to believe that their maleness or femaleness is natural, in the same way that most heterosexuals want to believe their sexual orientation is natural. In fact, if you look at the entire spectrum of social and class issues, you will see a trend of people trying to naturalize their privileges in some way. Whether it be wealthy people who try to justify the huge gap between rich and poor by appropriating Darwin's theory of natural selection, or white people who make claims that they are smarter or more successful than people of color because of their biology or their genes. When it comes to gender, natural is the ultimate trump card because it takes the relevant issues, privilege and prejudice, off the table and frames the very real and legitimate perspectives of sexual minorities as unnatural or artificial, and therefore unworthy of any serious consideration. This is why I prefer the term cissexual. It denotes the only relevant difference between that population and those of us who are transsexual. Cissexuals have only ever experienced their subconscious and physical sexes being aligned. Of course. Of course, did I immediately. Third gendering and third sexing. Cissexual people who are in the earliest stages of accepting transsexuality and who have not fully come to terms with their cissexual privilege will often come to see trans people as inhabiting our own unique gender category that is separate from woman and man. I call this act third gendering or third sexing. While some attempts at third gendering trans people are clearly meant to be derogatory or sensationalistic, such as she-male or he-she, often less offensive ones occur regularly in discussions about transsexuals, such as SE, how do you fucking pronounce that? Or MTF. While MTF may be useful as an adjective, as it describes the direction of my transition, using it as a noun, i.e. literally referring to me as male to female, completely negates the fact that I identify and live as a woman. Personally, I believe that the popular use of MTF or FTM over trans woman or trans man, which are more respectful, easier to say, and less easily confused with one another, reflects either a conscious or unconscious desire on the part of many cissexuals to distinguish transsexual women and men from their cissexual counterparts. When discussing the act of third gendering, it is crucial to make a distinction when people who identify themselves as belonging to a third gender and those who actively third gender other people. As with any gender identity, when people see themselves as belonging to a third gender, that is their way of making sense of themselves and their place in the world. And it should be respected. As someone who has identified as bigender and genderqueer in the past, I believe that it's important for us to recognize and respect other people's gender identities, whatever they are. But it's for this very same reason that I object to people who actively third gender people against their own will or without their consent. I believe this propensity for third gendering others is simply a byproduct of the assumptive or non-consensual process of gendering. In other words, we are so compelled to gender people as women and men that when we come across someone who is not easily categorized that way, usually because of exceptional gender inclinations, we tend to isolate and distinguish them from the other two genders. There is a long history of the terms third gender and third sex being applied to homosexuals, intersex people, and transgender people by those who consider themselves to have normal genders. This strongly suggests that the tendency to third gender people stems from both gender entitlement and oppositional sexism. Oh my, I can fucking register that was moving. Oh boy. Passing centrism. Another example where language presupposes that transsexual and cissexual genders are of inherently different worth is the use of the word pass. Well, the word pass serves a purpose in that it describes the very real privilege experienced by those transsexuals who receive conditional cissexual privilege when living as their identified sex. It is a highly problematic term in that it implies that the trans person is getting away with something. Upon close examination, it becomes quite obvious that the concept of passing is steeped in cissexual privilege, as it's only ever applied to trans people. For example, if a store clerk were to say "thank you, sir" to a cissexual woman, nobody would say that she passed as a man or failed to pass as a woman. Instead, we would say she is a woman and was mistaken for a man. Further, we never use the word passing to describe cissexual men who lift weights every day in order to achieve a more masculine appearance, or a cissexual woman who put on makeup, skirts, and heels to achieve a more feminine appearance. I suggest that we do actually refer to men who are like gym trying to put on muscle as men who are trying to pass as male. I think that's a little bit funny. Further, we never use the word passing to describe cis. Oh, I already read that. Yet, because I'm a transsexual woman, if I roll out of bed, throw on a t-shirt and jeans, and walk down the street and am generally recognized by others as female, despite my lack of concern for my appearance, I can still be dismissed as passing as a woman. The crux of the problem is the words pass and passing are active verbs. So when we say a transsexual is passing, it gives the false impression that they are the only active participant in this scenario, i.e. the transsexual is working hard to achieve a certain gendered appearance, and everyone else is passively being duped or not duped by the transsexual's performance. However, I would argue that the reverse is true. The public is the primary participant by virtue of their incessant need to gender every person they see as either male or female. The transsexual can react to this situation in one of two ways. They can either try to live up to public expectations about maleness and femaleness in an attempt to fit in and avoid stigmatization, or they can disregard public expectations and simply be themselves. However, if they choose the latter, the public will still judge them based on whether they appear female or male, and of course, others may still accuse them of passing, even though they have not actively done anything. Thus, the active role played by those who compulsively distinguish between women and men, and who discriminate between transsexuals and cissexuals, is made invisible by the concept of passing. This is some real shit I never considered. Don't you know that going to the gym as a man is reinforcing gender stereotypes? You as a man should subvert gender stereotypes and put on a skirt. Maybe pick a new name. Try some new pronouns. Awesome. Oh. This is the part of this chapter of Celeste where it gets really annoying. It should be mentioned that this view of passing is further supported by the use of the word with regards to other social class issues. For instance, a gay man can pass for straight, or a fair-skinned person of color can pass for white. Sometimes people work hard to pass, and other times they don't try at all. Either way, the one thing that remains consistent is that the word pass is used to shift blame away from the majority group's prejudice and towards the minority person's presumed motives and actions, which explains why people who pass are often accused of deception or infiltration if they are ever found out. One funny bit of TikTok micro discourse that I picked up is white people accusing non-white people of being white passing. I need you to sit with that for a second. White people accusing non-white people of being white passing. If you, a white person, are calling someone white passing, inherently they are not white passing because you are white and you have identified that they are non-white, right? White people don't get to use that. It is completely stupid as a white person to use a term like that. It's not for you. Right? Anyways. It has been my experience that most cis-sexuals are absolutely obsessed about whether transsexuals pass or not. From clinical and academic accounts to TV, movies, and magazine articles, cis-sexuals spend an exorbitant amount of energy indulging in their fascination regarding what transsexuals do. The medical procedures, how we modify our behaviors, etc., in order to pass as our identified sex. This passing centrism also allows cis-sexuals to ignore their own cis-sexual privilege, and also serves to privilege the transsexuals' assigned sex over their identified and lived sex, thereby reinforcing the idea that transsexual genders are illegitimate. Ironically, it has been common for cis-sexuals to claim that transsexuals are the ones obsessed with passing. Such accusations dismiss the countless transsexuals who are not concerned with how they are perceived by others, and also make invisible the fact that both parties have disparate vested interests when it comes to transsexual passing. Specifically, while transsexuals have no legitimate reason to be concerned whether any given transsexual passes, other than as a means to exercise cis-sexual privilege over them, transsexuals understand that being taken seriously in our identified sex has extraordinary ramifications on our quality of life. Living in this extraordinarily cis-sexist and oppositionally sexist world, transsexuals recognize cis-sexual privilege for what it is, a privilege. Being accepted as members of our identified sex makes it infinitely easier for us to gain employment and housing, to be taken seriously in our personal, social, and political endeavors, and to be able to walk down the street without being harassed or assaulted. Oh, I hate this stupid part. Ah! There we go. Cissexuals, not transsexuals, are the ones who create, foster, and enforce passing by their tendency to treat transsexuals in dramatically different ways based solely on the superficial criteria of our appearances. If a transsexual does not pass, cissexuals often use it as an excuse to deny that person the common decency of having their self-identified gender acknowledged or respected. Sometimes cissexuals even use these situations as if they were an invitation to openly humiliate or abuse transsexuals. And those of us who pass are undoubtedly treated better by cissexuals, although not necessarily with respect. As a transsexual who passes, I find it quite common for cissexuals, upon discovering my trans status, to praise me using the same condescending tone of voice that people use when praising gay people who don't flaunt their homosexuality, i.e., who act straight, or racial minorities who use proper English, i.e., who act white. In other words, these are backhanded compliments designed to reinforce cissexual superiority. The most common of these comments, "You look just like a real woman," would clearly be taken as an insult if it were said to a cissexual woman. Another common comment is, "I would have never guessed that you're a transsexual," which essentially praises me for looking cissexual-like, once again insinuating that cissexuals are inherently better than transsexuals. Because the term passing creates a double standard between cissexual and transsexual genders and enables cissexual gender entitlement, we should instead adopt language that rightfully recognizes this phenomenon as a byproduct of gendering and cissexual assumption. Therefore, I suggest using the term misgendered when cissexual or transsexual person is assigned a gender that does not match the gender they consider themselves to be, and the term appropriately gendered when others assign them a gender that matches the way they self-identify. And as mentioned previously, the term conditional cissexual privilege ought to be adopted to describe what has historically been referred to as passing privilege. People still use the word passing so much.
Yummy snack.
Yay! Waiter, waiter, more calories, please.
Yummy Slurpee.
Ah! Here we go. Taking one's gender for granted. An additional problem with the word pass is that it is typically only used in reference to a transsexual's identified sex rather than their assigned sex. This gives the impression that transsexuals only begin managing other people's perceptions after we transition. Consider that people will talk about the fact that I now pass as a woman, but nobody ever asks about how difficult it must be for me to pass as a man before. Personally, I found it infinitely more difficult and stressful to manage my perceived gender back when people presumed I was male than I do now as female. Oh. However, once we start thinking in terms of whether a transsexual is being misgendered or appropriately gendered in accordance with their understanding of themselves, as opposed to whether they are passing or not in the eyes of others, then we start to gain a more accurate and realistic appreciation of the transsexual experience. In fact, you could say that most transsexuals have the experience of being misgendered throughout their childhoods and sometimes well into their adulthoods. The extent to which this constant misgendering during our formative years shapes our relationship with genders and our self-perception cannot be underestimated. Having only ever had a trans experience, it took me a while to realize how differently I experience and process gender compared to the way most cis-sexuals do. For example, a few months after I had begun living full-time as a woman, a male friend of mine asked me if I had ever accidentally gone into a men's restroom by mistake. At first, the question struck me as bizarre. When I gave him a perplexed look, he tried to clarify himself. He said that he doesn't ever think about what restroom he is entering, never really notices the little man symbol on the door, but he always ends up in the right place anyway. So I was wondering whether I'd accidentally gone into the men's bathroom by habit since my transition. I laughed and told him that there had never been a single instance in my life when I'd walked into a public restroom, women's or men's, by habit. My entire life I've been excruciatingly aware of any gendered space that I enter. I have a pizza to make? Oh my god, can I have some? Can I have some, please? I'm so hungry. Pizza. Share some with the class. Chat pizza party. Yeah, if you're gonna make pizza, everyone gets a slice, and I get the rest. Growing up trans, having to manage both the psychological dissonance between my physical and subconscious sex, as well as the constant barrage of being misgendered by others, was a harrowing experience and one that caused me to dissociate myself from my own body and emotions. And while physically transitioning and living in my identified sex has allowed me to finally overcome my gender dissonance, I still struggle with an intense hypersensitivity to gender, and more specifically to gendering. Having never had an opportunity to learn to experience my gender as being unquestionable or second nature, as my friend had, I still sometimes feel an awkward jolt when people refer to me as she, even though the pronoun is preferable to me. When I look at photos or videos of myself, I still can't help but see the boy in my face, or hear it in the sound of my voice, even though I hadn't had anyone call me sir in over 5 years. I feel assaulted and get extraordinarily upset whenever I'm watching TV or a movie and I'm blindsided by a joke or an ignorant comment that dismisses trans people's identified sex or refers to them by their assigned sex. And although I experience gender concordance these days, I still constantly dwell on gender, which, while helpful when writing a book on the subject, can often be unhealthy and exhausting. My gender hypersensitivity reminds me of what a friend once told me about her relationship with money. She grew up in a family where money was scarce, and where fights regularly stemmed from the financial strain they were under. This irrevocably altered the way my friend relates to money. While most of us who have had middle-class upbringings see money as simply a means to get the things we want or need, for my friend it also carries an added emotional element. Even though she is now on more solid ground financially, she still feels undeserving when she receives money and guilt every time she spends it. It still preoccupies her and fills her with anxiety because she doesn't feel like she can ever take it for granted. She understands that it can be taken away from her at any time. I feel that. My friend's relationship with money reminds me of my own continuing insecurity regarding gender. Even though I've finally reached a point where I feel comfortable living in my own body, I often feel undeserving and guilty about it. And while everyone else around me seems to feel entitled to their gender to the point where they take it for granted, I always feel like mine can be taken away from me at any minute. And in a sense, it can, and often is, whenever somebody attempts to wield cis-sexual privilege over me. Okay. Distinguishing between transphobia and cis-sexual privilege. The fact that transsexuals have survived a childhood of constantly being misgendered creates major differences in the way that we and other queers react to public expressions of gender anxiety. For example, a cis-sexual butch dyke friend of mine shared with me an experience she had of being accused of being a man in a woman's restroom, presumably because of her masculine style of dress and mannerisms. The woman who made the accusation confronted her in a gender-entitled way by saying, "You don't belong here." My friend, who was obviously disturbed by the incident, responded by pointing to her own breasts and saying, "I am a woman and I do belong here," which had the effect of making the accuser feel embarrassed and apologetic. While my friend does not identify as transgender, one could describe this incident as an example of transphobia. She was targeted because her appearance transgressed gender norms. I'm sometimes struck by how broad, relatively speaking, transphobia was back then, 20 years ago. This would not be seen as transphobic, I think, today. I don't know. It's complicated. And when the accuser apologized, she in effect belatedly extended cis-sexual privilege to my friend. That is to say, the accuser recognized my friend as a legitimate, albeit gender non-conforming woman, and as such, acknowledged my friend's right to share that woman-only space with her. I tell this story because it is so radically different from the way some of my trans woman friends experience similar situations. When a transsexual woman is accused of being a man in a woman's room, it's against the backdrop of the transsexual having been misgendered as male all of her life. Thus, rather than feeling like she has been unfairly targeted because of her behaviors transgress gender norms, as many cis-sexual queers feel, she will instead feel targeted because of her transsexual status. In other words, she will assume that the accuser is exercising cis-sexual privilege over her. And the transsexual woman is often correct in assuming this. After all, the accuser became apologetic when my butch dyke friend told her, "I am a woman." In other words, she was belatedly read as a cis-sexual woman. But when my trans woman friends say I am a woman, they are often still accused of being men. In other words, they are read as transsexual women and thus denied cis-sexual privilege. Okay. It used to be kind of comical when I died in like 5 seconds. Now it's just how it works. It's just how it goes. Recognizing the difference between transphobia, which targets those whose gender expression and appearance differ from the norm, and cissexual privilege, which targets those whose assigned and identified sexes differ, is important, especially when one tries to make sense of contemporary queer trans politics. For example, some queer women's events and establishments have policies that specifically exclude trans women from attending. Proponents of such policies often claim that they are not transphobic because they do allow some transgender identified people to attend, as long as they were born female. Thus, rather than calling trans women exclusion policies transphobic, it's more accurate to say that they are cis-sexist, as they refuse to accept transsexual women's female identities as being legitimate as those of cis-sexual women. Such policies may also be called transmisogynistic, as they favor FGM spectrum trans people over MTF spectrum trans folks. Furthermore, those female-born cissexuals, regardless of whether they are transgender identified, who choose to attend such events can be said to be exercising their cissexual privilege, i.e., they are taking advantage of all of the privileges associated with their female birth sex. Indeed, it is disappointing that most cissexual transgender and queer folks, particularly those who hypocritically accuse transsexuals of trying to attain passing privilege by transitioning to identified sex, have given little to no thought about the countless ways they frequently indulge their own cissexual privilege. Once we understand cissexual privilege, it becomes evident that many acts of discrimination that have previously been lumped under the term transphobia are probably better described in terms of cissexism. Next, I will reconsider a number of discriminatory acts, focusing on the ways that they are more specifically designed to undermine the legitimacy of trans people's identified genders rather than targeting trans people for breaking oppositional gender norms. Very short little thing. Little baby chapter. The babiest chapter of them all. Ah, damn it. Trans exclusion. Trans exclusion is perhaps the most straightforward act of prejudice against transsexuals. Simply stated, trans exclusion occurs when cissexuals exclude transsexuals from any spaces, organizations, or events designated for the trans person's identified gender. Trans exclusion may also include other instances where the trans person's identified gender is dismissed. For example, when someone insists on calling me a man, or purposely uses inappropriate pronouns when addressing me. Considering how big of a social faux pas it is in our culture to misgender someone, and how apologetic people generally become upon finding out that they have made a mistake, it is difficult to feel trans exclusion, i.e., the deliberate misgendering of transsexuals, as anything other than an arrogant attempt to belittle and humiliate trans people. God, when I was like 17 or something, I worked at a grocery store, and this one older lady like misgendered me by accident. And she, I swear to God, apologized for like 5 whole fucking minutes. When she saw that I had facial hair. Like, I don't care, just move on, man. Oh my god. Trans objectification. I've gotten in. Oh, I thought I was in the wrong bathrooms a few times. The same search, long hair and facial hair. Oh, yeah. People see long hair and just go, oh, that's a woman. Like, I feel like Julia Serano makes the observation that most people, like, go for secondary sex characteristics when gendering someone. I don't. I think it's just facial hair. I swear to God, it's mostly just facial hair. And the rest is all gender presentation. The objectification of transsexual bodies is very much intertwined with the cissexual's obsession with passing. While our physical transitions typically occur over a period of a few years, a mere fraction of our lives, they almost completely dominate cissexual discourses regarding transsexuality. The reason for this is clear. Focusing almost exclusively on our physical transformations keeps transsexuals forever anchored in our assigned sex, thus turning our identified sex into a goal that we are always approaching, but never truly achieve. This not only undermines our very real experiences living as members of our identified sex post-transition, but purposefully sidesteps the crucial issue of cissexual prejudice against transsexuals. Akin to how some heterosexuals focus their interests on what gays, lesbians, and bisexuals do in the bedroom, i.e., how we have sex, in order to avoid contemplating whether their own behaviors and attitudes contribute to the same sex discrimination. Another common form of trans objectification occurs when cissexuals become hung up on, disturbed by, or obsessed over supposed discrepancies that exist between a transsexual's physical sex and identified gender. Most typically, such attention is focused on a trans person's genitals, because objectification reduces the transsexual to the status of a thing. It enables cissexuals to condemn, demonize, fetishize, ridicule, criticize, and exploit us without guilt or remorse. I might call another break time soon-ish. Rest my throat a little bit from all the reading. Although, I am very close to the end. Okay, never mind, no break time. We're at the end. I think that actually went better than last time. Yeah.
Yummy snack.
Yay! No Slurpee without snack. Yay! Hmm. I'm trying to see if I can do it without the double boost. Almost. I swear, almost. Oh, there we go. I think I should read House of Leaves in this format. Oh. How many deaths was that? Okay, I do think that was actually fewer. Yeah, just ever so slightly fewer. Oh. Because I got through that a lot faster. I think it's just a shorter chapter as well. Fucking yeah. After this, I only have the summit.
Yummy Slurpee.
And after that, if I still haven't finished the book, I gotta come up with something else.
Yummy snack.
Yay. Getting all your snacks and slurpees. So, any thoughts on the book so far, and especially what we discussed today? anything. Good and true. Should be required reading for all Tumblr users. Yeah, I think we've established that. I want to know what you're reading next. I don't know where to go from here, to be honest. I honestly think next time I do this, I'll read some Marx. Just good old Karl Marx. Playing Stardew Valley and reading Karl Marx's Das Kapital. And original German, because I want to learn German. Probably like old German as well. Her distinction between cissexism and transphobia is very interesting. True. Because the thing she defines as cissexism is stuff I've seen people just only describe as transphobia before, right? I don't know. I kind of fuck with that, like, academic specificity, you know? Having specific language to describe specific things, specific kinds of behavior, specific beliefs. I think cissexism is considered a type of transphobia. Yeah, I really like how she dissects it into its components. Yeah, it's really good. I'm not sure what the distinction is. Did she define both terms somewhere in there? I think she defines transphobia really early in the book as just what it says on the tin, a hatred, disgust, or fear of trans people, right? Oh. And then cissexism is the very specific behavior of holding trans people to a higher standard with regards to their genders um, than cis people, right? So, like, for example, a woman putting on lipstick and makeup is considered natural and normal. When a trans person does it, she's trying too hard, right? Clearly, she's faking it. Putting in too much effort or trying too hard to fit into stereotypes or whatever the fuck. But when a cis woman does it, it's fine and normal. Right? I think that's what she means with cis sexism, I think. Decently useful, I think. I think she's using a broader definition of transgender than we tend to use today, so is transphobia also broader? Yeah, there was one point where she described a situation that we just read, right? Where like a cis woman who is very butch walked into a woman's restroom and some other woman told her, "You don't belong here." And because of her like gender non-conforming presentation, she described this behavior as being transphobic, right? Because she apparently, for that moment, looked too man for that, right? And I don't really know what I would call this today. And we still have people point out that cis people also suffer under transphobia, I guess. Often about reproductive rights. um, I feel like the day you describe the situation in the bathroom is like gender essentialist, right? In some way. I still think that woman was being transphobic but dropped it when she realized she was against the cis woman. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah. Like transphobic, like it's transphobic because for that moment she assumed the other person would. Um See, the thing is, at no point in that situation did the woman who did the bigotry think that the woman she was being bigoted against was trans, though. And I feel like that's important, I guess. Like in the modern context of trans, where she assumed this person was either a trans man or a trans woman, right? She just saw a butch woman and said, "You don't belong in the women's bathroom," right? Would you describe this situation as transphobic? I don't think I would, because there were no trans people in this situation. And, I don't think the person being bigoted was doing it because she thought that the other person was trans. So, how would you describe this kind of bigotry? I think that's my contention here. It's just under a modern definition, a gender non-conforming cis woman isn't considered transgender. She's considered a gender non-conforming cis woman, right? Would we just describe this as like misogynist because she didn't properly uphold feminine standards of beauty or whatever, of like conformity? I think we might just describe that as misogynist. Like assuming that a woman isn't a woman because she isn't feminine enough, right? Would we just say that this is misogyny today? I think that would be more correct. I think it would be most useful to describe this as oppositionally sexist, right? Because the woman sees the other woman's masculine dress and features and assumes there's no way that could be a woman. So he must be in the wrong bathroom. He doesn't belong here, right? I think oppositional sexism is a really useful term for this specifically, but in a modern context, they wouldn't describe it as transphobic, right? I would call this a type of misogyny. I would call this oppositional sexism, I think. All right. Any other questions about the book or about the stream in general? Deer emoji. I guess not. Being cryptic in chat. Awesome. Alright, I still have to download and edit together the previous stream, and I'll do that after tonight. And then hopefully by tomorrow, that stream, the previous one, the one with all the internet issues, will be uploaded, and then I can upload this one on the VOD channel as well. So if you do like reading along, yeah, keep that in mind. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna end the stream. Good night. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.